Hello, welcome to MJRRPG, a podcast for tabletop role-playing games, reviews, replays, etc., etc. This is a review for the Call of Cthulhu scenario, The Mummy of Pemberley Grange, which was the first entry in Type 40's Seeds of Terror, a series of bite-sized, one-off scenarios, most of which clock in at about 5 pages of actual scenario text. You can read the text version of this review at mjrrpg.com. There's also a narrative replay of my run of the scenario, either in podcast or text form. The first part of this review is safe for players and keepers with minimal spoilers. Midway through, I'll warn off intrepid players and move on to explaining things in depth with suggestions for keepers. In short, this is a fun and tense 1 to 3 hour little scenario for groups of any experience level, though it likely needs some tweaking rather than being a complete zero prep scenario, as it is sometimes described. The Mummy of Pemberley Grange, like all the Seeds of Terror scenarios, is a very short scenario. This one's only 6 pages, sans handouts, meant to be run with minimal prep and in a short evening playtime. In a way, they're comparable to the official Gateways to Terror scenarios by Chaosium, but find them to be denser despite having much less text, and require more than a little bit of buy-in from the players, as well as more ability to think on the fly and improvise from the keeper. It's also very dependent on its pre-gen investigators, and requires significant tuning to fit into any campaign with pre-existing investigators. Though I don't really see that as a negative. The packaged investigators are pretty varied and fun, and this is indeed very much a one-shot. Pemberley Grange is very straight to the point. There is a problem front and center, and the players must solve it quickly. The scenario has a built-in timer that can be emphasized or ignored to tighten or loosen the playtime. I ran the scenario loosely and it clocked in about 2.5 hours, but a focus group or harsher GMing could easily blow through it in an hour. For groups looking for a tight and semi-stressful investigation-focused session, The Mummy of Pemberley Grange will fit the bill. Its pre-gen player characters are also colorful and varied, and give players plenty of ammo for fun role-playing and bouncing off each other. I do think the scenario requires a little extra work on the part of the keeper, and some of the handouts leave something to be desired. Despite being very colorful, they're not really useful. They don't have a lot of practical use. Overall, I would happily recommend the scenario to any group looking for a quick evening involving a mummy, it's in the title, not a spoiler, with a Cthulhu mythos twist. The rest of this review will spoil everything, so if you're a player hoping to go through this someday, go away now. But first tell your keeper about it, and there are links to grab the scenario down in the show notes. Should only be keepers here now, or players that already went through the scenario, so let's carry on. Pemberley Mansion is a mystery, with little social or combat skills being necessary or involved in solving the problem. The characters are cursed by the mummy, sucking their POW until it resurrects and starts hunting them. To break the curse, the investigators must cook and consume the mummy's organs while chanting a prayer. There are only 3 real clues, though only 2 of them are necessary, those being the prayer and the recipe. But with both written in Arabic, they require one investigator in particular to use them. If that player notices both clues quickly enough, the scenario could be concluded well within an hour. And with only 3 detailed locations, the library with the player clue, the reception room with the mummy and the recipe clue, and the kitchen, this is very doable. As with any game, this can of course go completely off the rails in any manner of awful or wonderful ways depending on your group's ingenuity or insanity. While the scenario is certainly less preparation intensive than others, I wouldn't call it zero prep or run out of the box ready, and I had 2 worries before starting that I felt needed to be prepared for. The building's 2nd floor and a contingency case for quick investigator deaths or a TPK. The first issue stems from the scenario's handouts. There are 3, 2 of which are props without much practical usage, and the last being a very nicely drawn map of the building. Unfortunately, the map has the glaring omission of only being for the first story of the building, despite having multiple staircases. Inquisitive players will note the stairs, and the scenario text doesn't mention anything about the upper floors. I didn't see any bedrooms in the map, so I inferred that the upper floors would mostly be used for the hostess's private rooms and guest rooms. But luckily enough for me, my group didn't have any time to poke around upstairs. The second issue is highly variable depending on the group and desired length of the scenario. If you're aiming for only an hour or so of gaming, there's no particular problem with giving the players complete freedom. If you are planning for 2 to 3 hours though, Some blinders may need to be put up, otherwise the scenario is surprisingly deadly and risks a player or two being taken out early on, or even the whole party being wiped out. The causes of this are 1. Solving the mystery heavily rests on one investigator and their Arabic language skill, 2. Leaving the reception room, and 3. Not fleeing the location. If the particular investigator does not read the necessary clues, which to be fair are very easy to find, and quickly passes over them, there's a chance they'll die, in which case it's impossible to win the scenario. This came close to occurring in my playthrough, as the investigator in question remained in the reception room. For the scenario to progress, the mummy must awaken and leave the reception room, ideally when no one is present. If an investigator is present though, the mummy will eventually awaken and attack. With its skills, and not to mention invulnerability, it is likely to slaughter any investigators in its path. The option to flee is acknowledged in the conclusion section, but only by suggesting all the player characters die a slow and painful death if they leave. Almost any single location scenario that doesn't physically lock up players will of course require some extra buy-in from the players so they don't just leave. As written, fleeing the scene in this scenario does seem to be an acceptable strategy once the mummy awakens. The simplest way to give the players a hint that this won't work is rather than simply killing them in an epilogue, to continue draining their POW until they turn back. To counter these potential issues, and to slightly expand the scenario as I had a 3-hour window to play it, I added 2 servant NPC characters. One as a secret cultist to either draw the investigators away from the reception room, or to keep them from fleeing too early, depending on their actions, and the other servant to basically work as additional body count, if necessary. While this addition made for some good fun and complications, I'm not sure if this worked exactly as I wanted it to, and if I run the scenario again I may just leave it as is, even if it means a very short game. In our run, the players quickly split up, with most staying in the reception room with the still dormant mummy. Some fortunate sand loss and insanity led to one investigator eventually fleeing to a different room, and I saw this as a chance to get the others out of the reception room, hopefully allowing the mummy to wake up without slaughtering too many of the investigators. The cultist servant sprang a gun on the insane investigator, leading him away to the library and drawing away 2 more investigators in pursuit. One player did remain behind though, and of course it was the character with the crucial Arabic skill. Nearing the hour 15 mark, the mummy awoke at the same time as a near shootout erupted with the cultist servant. The investigator broke away from the mummy by the skin of his teeth with a great brawl roll and some luck spending, while the others disarmed the cultist. But with the mummy on the prowl and obviously impervious to violence, the investigators rationally decided to flee. This occurred a little after the 2nd hour, and with one investigator insane and nearly powerless, the other also suffering from heavy POW loss, I saw little chance of the game ending on time without heavy-handed direction, and so they fled, and one by one succumbed to the POW draining curse. I found it actually a rather satisfying ending, and I didn't notice any players being particularly upset by it. It became something of an achievement, actually, as none of us had experienced a TPK via POW loss before. Ultimately, it worked due to timing, and had it come to the same conclusion an hour earlier, we may have been a little disappointed. But really, who doesn't like a downer ending, with an ancient Egyptian cultist priestess mummy once again walking the earth to do her dark deeds? Despite the minor complaints, I very much enjoyed running the scenario, and look forward to doing so again. I think it could also be a useful way to practice pacing, or be a great convention scenario paired with a strict 1 or 2 hour time limit. I'm already looking forward to replaying this one. You can pick it up at DriveThruRPG individually, or as part of a 3-set bundle, or through Type 40's Patreon page. Again, links in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to hear the full story of my run of the game, I have a narrative replay episode of this scenario, or you could read it on the website if you hate the sound of my voice. I do hope you come back next time for more reviews and replays. Have a good one.